A very pleasant good afternoon to all of our viewers and those joining us via Second Advent Radio. We are delighted once again to welcome you to another edition of Let's Talk. We are delighted once again to welcome you to another edition today. And we pray by God's grace that the information we share with you will prove meaningful. We are looking forward to what promises to be a very exciting discussion. We have back with us this afternoon two of our guests from last week, and we should be joined shortly by a third. We are today, in fact, just permit me to say that we have for the last few weeks been discussing various aspects of religious liberty. Today, in this final discussion, we will consider the subject of religious liberty and our relationship with other Christians and other religions. We are seeking to look at this topic because we have had so much inquiries regarding how we should relate to other Christians and how we should relate to other non-Christian religions. It is an important discussion because, if for nothing else, many members have so many questions regarding this one, and we're hoping today that we'll be able to bring clarity to some of these issues. We would like, even before we introduce our guest again, to invite you at this time to have a word of prayer with us. Father, be with us as we go into today's discussion. Grant us your peace, grant us understanding, be with our guests, give them wisdom. May they be able to articulate their perspectives in a meaningful way. We're still awaiting one of our guests. We pray that he will join shortly, and grant that we will have a meaningful discussion. In your precious name we pray. Amen. So friends, this afternoon, I am delighted to welcome you to Let's Talk again and to share with you our two guests. They were with us last week, attorney Michelle Slack out of Nevis and attorney Leslyn Charles. If you were with us last week, you would have heard their contributions and know that they are quite capable, quite qualified to speak to us on religious liberty matters. We are expecting Dr. Clive Dutton to join us shortly. We trust that he will before we're through, because we really do want to get his perspective as well as we discuss this very important subject. He is the Religious Liberty Director for the Caribbean Union of Seventh-day Adventists, and so we are expecting him to join us in short order. Attorney Slack and attorney Charles, good afternoon and welcome to Let's Talk.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Dr. Greene. It's such a pleasure being here to share again this week.
Likewise. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Dr. Greene, for the invitation again. I am happy to be here, and I look forward to a very meaningful discussion.
Certainly, indeed. Well, we're going to go right into it. Time tends to move very quickly these days. So, when we talk about religious liberty, I understand that we mean that we acknowledge and respect the right of every individual to choose his or her religion, and his or her right not just to choose, but also to worship freely. When this right is denied, the right to choose and to worship, to exercise, maybe I should say to choose and to exercise, how far should we as Christians go in as Seventh-day Adventists, religious liberty advocates? How far should we go in assisting or supporting the victim, especially when we believe differently? For example, if the government should make it illegal for Christians to worship on Sundays, I said Sundays, not Saturdays, on Sundays, what should be our approach to this? Attorney Slack, let's start with you.
Sure. I believe the starting point for the question is an acknowledgement of where this concept of religious liberty really comes from. And before anything else, it is love and respect for every member of the human family, which is what Jesus taught, love. And respect for our brothers and sisters, whether they believe everything that we also believe or whether they believe completely different to what we believe. Also, the Constitution in our jurisdictions enshrine the right of every individual to choose to worship in the way that they deem fit for them. So we have freedom of religion, freedom to worship in the way that we choose to. We have freedom of expression, freedom of conscience, and these are rights that are expressed in our constitutions. And so that is where our religious liberty stems from. And when we consider that coupled with love, which is what as Christians we ought to share with each other, we would understand that we can't just hold religious liberty as a concept or an ideal. It requires more than just believing something, and it requires that we put it into action when it is that there is a case of another member of the human family suffering because their religious liberty is being infringed upon. And so if it is that the government passes this mandate to make it illegal for someone to worship in the way that they want to worship, to my mind, it would not be in keeping with our Christian principles to remain silent on a matter such as that. It may seem controversial because you mentioned Sunday worship, which is in contradistinction to what we believe, but there is a limit to which we can go. I don't need to fully accept what you are doing to assist you in fighting for generally what the concept is. So I believe in freedom of expression and freedom of religion, and there ought not to be an issue with me supporting the endeavor of somebody who is being disadvantaged in the way that they express their freedom of express their religion.
Okay, thank you so much, Attorney. Attorney Charles, let's get your addition to this.
Yes, I like the perspective Attorney Slack started from. It really does start with love and respect, and it really has not much to do with the fact that somebody believes differently from what we believe. Sometimes we have concepts and principles and we stick to it like a rule, and it doesn't mean much if we just make it a rule and not look at the fact that these are other human beings seeking to have their right respected. And so irrespective of whether we believe what the other person believes, we should really support as far as it does not infringe on our right, or as far as it does not cause us to contrary to what we believe also. And I like the point that Attorney Slack made when she said we shouldn't stay silent. Sometimes we take the position of just staying quiet when that might even be more injurious than actually saying something. So if this were to happen, because it could happen to us also, and we may need the support, we really ought to speak out because it's about love and respect outside of the legal aspect.
Now, I want to take that very point that Attorney Slack first and you reiterated, that we should not stay silent. I take this to mean that, and let's use the same example that I made reference to. If a government in the Caribbean should say, hey, listen, it's going forward is going to be illegal for anybody to worship on Sundays. Now, we as Seventh Adventists may say, well, you know, that is not going to impact us because we don't, Saturday is the day of worship, and some Seventh Adventists may even rejoice and say, praise the Lord, why did it take so long to wake up and realize reality? But you're saying that we should not stay silent. Let's expand on this a little bit. By not staying silent, you're saying, hey, that we should sound the alarm, say to the government, you're interfering in one religious right. We are going to advocate for these individuals who are thus affected to be given the right to worship as they desire. Am I hearing you correctly? Is that the point?
Yes, that's the point, because a time will come when we will be on the other side of the fence. As Seventh-day Adventists, we know there's going to be a time of persecution, and even before that time, when it's leading up to that, we will need support at some point in time. So we will need to interact with these persons in the group, let them know we understand how they feel, because it could happen to us also, find some common ground there so that we could support them. And even if it means, because I've known of Seventh-day Adventists going to the Equal Rights Commission, and in Guyana, we've gone to meetings and we've had discussions on how we could support other religious groups. And that's why we have a Public Affairs and Religious Liberty Department. We ought not to stay silent and keep in the background. We ought to, interact and be a part of these issues, because our turn is coming too.
Very well. Friends, this is going to be a very interesting discussion this afternoon. And we are joined by Dr. Dutton. We are delighted to have you, Pastor. For a moment, I thought that you were not going to make it at all, but I'm glad you're here. Yes. So we have been talking to the issue of the extent to which we should get involved when someone else's religious right is denied, even though we don't agree with that someone else on their perspective. And the two attorneys here indicate that we should not just acknowledge the rights of the individuals or groups to freedom of worship, but we should not stay silent and turn a blind eye to their not being able to worship based on their conscience and on their personal choice. Now, that's a very interesting perspective. I want to move on a little bit and perhaps along the same line. So let's suppose that some group, for whatever reason, begins to burn churches, Christian churches that worship on Sundays, and I'm taking a deliberate slant for a reason. So let's suppose that there is this group that becomes radical and begins to persecute churches that worship on Sundays, and begins to destroy them. And let's suppose that the Pentecostal or the Baptist church building in your community is thus destroyed. And they, the Pentecostals, the Baptists, or whichever other denomination is affected, were to approach you and say, hey, listen, your building is standing strong and tall. Nobody is destroying your building. Would you allow us to conduct our worship services in your building? How should we respond? Would it be a denial of the religious rights of those groups to refuse them? Or on the other hand, would it be a support to religious liberty to allow them to use the facility?
Well, good afternoon, everyone. I had some problems getting on, I had some connectivity issues just now. I'm home. So I want to say happy Sabbath to all, and I'm happy to be here. We had, well, almost a 90% similar case in 2011. We didn't have a burning of a church, we had a demolition of a church, a Baptist church. And it's amazing that you mentioned Baptist. And I was approached to defend the Baptist faith. Now, it started with Carla, because Oswald Peer was the General Secretary of Carla at that time, 2011. This case went on and on and on for a number of years. But we did a lot of research to find out, well, why would a group? Because Central Trinidad is predominantly Hindu and Muslim. So the Baptists like us were in the minority. We were wondering what, and clearly some capitalists were involved because there was a land grab issue. And this Baptist faith had been on that compound for 26 years. So the right to worship, all right, is compulsory. We have to see it that way, whether it is Baptist, whether it's Adventist, wherever it is. So they invited me. They were having a service on the compound in a tent because the church was demolished. All right. So they have a academic. She teaches at the UE, Dr. De Pisa, and she was the one who was the bridge to us. And that started a relationship that has gone on for 11 years now. So I went in there, I defended them. There were regional representatives, and then there was the major issue. This was no longer a private issue, it was public, or they were going to have a press conference. And this case had survived 3 prime ministers 3 prime ministers promised them the deed to the land, and it just didn't happen. They didn't get the deed to the land. So the persons who wanted the land to put up business, they had high connectivity with the government of the day. So what you are doing, you're not just fighting the capitalists, you're fighting the government connections, you know. So that is what happened. So I went in there and I defended them. When we had a meeting, Dean got a little more technical because the trade union was there. David Abdullah was there. And he said it's a cause of justice and all of us should get on board. And to cut a long story short, it didn't reach the place where they wanted to worship in our church. But I would support that 1,000,000% if they said, okay, Cuba Church is not too far. It's in Maillard Street, about, I would say, 1/4 mile from where their spot is. And I would have agreed, you know, for the church, because in America, you know, several churches worship in one building sometimes, and we rent from other churches. And I'm saying if it's right for us to rent from another church, we should have no problem another church worshiping here. So I know for some people it's a technical thing, but everyone has the right to worship. All right. I just want to say that if we are broad-minded enough and have a broad worldview to allow another church to worship, in a circumstance like this, where the church is demolished, I would have no problem with it whatsoever.
I think we appreciate that contribution there. I want to follow up though. The total is over here. Let me ask you. React to this. I hear Pastor Dutton saying that real example that he jumped in and he defended the Baptists in the case when the church was demolished. I don't know if Pastor Dutton is back with us before I go to the attorneys, because I wanted to ask him, Pastor Dutton, if you're here. And
I'm here.
Yeah. What I wanted to ask you, what was the reaction of not Baptists and other denominations, but what was the reaction of Seventh-day Adventists to your involvement in this, to you going in and defending the rights of the Baptists? Did you get any negative pushback from some of your brethren?
Well, no, I can't recall getting a negative pushback. I know some would have a concern when the trade unions got involved, because he's not head of just one trade union, all right, of the umbrella body. Okay, and it was a press conference, it was carried live. So I got some positive comments. I don't know if those who disagreed with it remain, you know, pretty quiet. But there was no public negative feedback. Let me just say that.
Okay, wonderful. Now, attorney,
Have we lost him, Leslie? Oh, Michelle?
For a little bit, it sounded that way.
It appears that there was a little connection lost there. Are you hearing me now?
Yes, I'm hearing you now. Yes, sure.
Yeah. So there's a question that I want us to address, and I would like the attorneys to respond to this first, and then Pastor Dutton, you can comment on it afterwards. Somebody's asking. So we're talking about religious rights. We can understand the Baptists. We can understand the Pentecostals, the Roman Catholics, etc. Somebody's asking, what is the difference between a religion and a cult? So we can support religious rights and even defend the Baptists and the Pentecostals and the Pilgrim Holiness, etc. and so on. But suppose it's a cult, they're asking, do cults, and I'm reading the question as it came, do cults also have the same rights as religions? I would like the attorneys to respond to this, because I think it is important for the rest of what we want to share this afternoon.
What I would suggest is religious liberty is a concept that applies generally. So it is not limited to other denominations, other Christian denominations. It would spread across religious groups and also include persons who have no religious affiliation as well. It includes your right to choose not to worship. And so the concept cannot be so limited, because then it becomes, it loses some of the meaning and the import of it if we are considering it from the standpoint of love for the human family and what Christ would have done.
Very interesting. Great. Now, Attorney Charles, that seems to suggest that, okay, so it's freedom to choose religion, to worship, or to have no religion. That's what I hear Attorney Slack saying. I can choose not to have any religion. Now, I sat on a body, I sit on a body, the Ecclesiastical Commission, and, we had a discussion relating to religious liberty, and somebody asked a question. What if, we were having a discussion regarding religious liberty, as I said, but the conversation went to, what if the government were to determine that voodoo becomes an official religion in our territory? How would we react or relate to defending the rights of the individual who claims that voodoo is their religion? Would we also defend them to do that? Before we go to Pastor Dutton, Attorney Charles, you're saying that the Constitution also protects that individual.
Yeah, the Constitution protects every individual, but legally, I think we might have a little bit of a challenge. For instance, in Guyana, we still have on our books that it is wrong to practice obia, and some people in their religious services or ceremonies, they practice what we call obia. So you might have a little crisscross in there and a little challenge, a little, we might have to get past some crossroads in terms of the legal aspect. However, I believe in terms of religious freedom, we can support as far as it does not go against our religious beliefs and principles. And there are some things that I don't know voodoo, but I've heard that might really go against the grain of what we believe. So we would have to be very careful how we're openly supporting that and the kind of reaction we might have from those in our churches. If it doesn't go against what we believe and weaken our influence in the public sphere, then I believe whatever we can do, but it should be limited to how it affects in that instance, because we're talking about non-Christians here, how it would affect the way we believe and the way others perceive what we believe based on our response.
Now somebody may argue, and Pastor Dutton, you can respond to this one, because somebody may argue that when you defended the Baptists, their belief on the day of worship goes against what we believe, but yet you defended them. So the Attorney General said, insofar as it doesn't go against what we believe. But do we take religious liberty too? Because that would that not suggest that we only support you when you align with our principles? Pastor Dutton, let me hear you on this, please.
Well, the group I defended is the spiritual Baptist, who have some qualities similar to what you would call as the voodoo. And if we had to rent them, we would hope they wouldn't practice it in there. But let me get closer home to Jamaica. All right, let's get closer home to Jamaica. The Restoration Pathway. You have heard about them, right? That's a case in 2022, all right, where some members were found dead in the church. I believe things like that is what perhaps Attorney Charles could have been referencing, because their practice apparently involved self-sacrifice, a kind of Jim Jones affair, and that was very extreme. So I would say, if they were saying we want to use your church, we would have to say no, because here is the principle of life being threatened, okay? And part of their practice was this encouraging people to sacrifice themselves as part of worship, okay? That is the most recent case in the Caribbean in terms of Jamaica. In terms of the voodoo, we will have to investigate that. I think the law in Trinidad is the same as the law in Guyana. It came from the British colonial rule. Okay, so we have to examine that too. I just wanted to say one more thing, Dr. Greene. We have to be careful with the term cult, because I think there's a very loose definition in the Caribbean. Okay, we are still being called a cult in some quarters. In fact, some evangelicals see us that way. So we have to define a cult, and we say to make it kind of, to put some crystalline quality to it, is one who has the extreme views, could have life-threatening views, have they don't really have allegiance. Their allegiance is to a person, all right? So like Jim Jones, all right, he could have influenced them, you know, to sacrifice their lives. So there's a life-threatening potential to it. Sunny Moon, you know, in Korea there. So we have got to look carefully at the definition of the term cult and ensure that it's a cult, because there are some areas where we are defined as a cult.
Now, if I go back to the response earlier from Attorney Slack, when she mentioned in response to my question, that same question with respect to whether we would defend the cults as the question came in, her response was that religious liberty is not to be restricted to a particular organization, but it is a concept that is to be applied generally. And she indicated that there is constitutional provision for that. It is enshrined in our Constitution. Now, I want to go a little further, because in the Caribbean, in Trinidad, in Guyana, in St. Kitts and Nevis, and I'm using those countries because you are all representing those countries, the Constitution provides for religious freedom and indicates that you have that right. What happens, though, when we go to certain other countries that their constitution do not so speak? For example, there are, you know, we mentioned the 1040 window, where if you decide to convert to Christianity, you're almost sentenced to death immediately by that action. How do we then define religious liberty in the context where in a particular jurisdiction, it is no longer a constitutional right? One of the attorneys want to speak to that, and then we hear from Pastor Dutton.
Okay, I'm reasoning this out. I am thinking, and based on what I indicated earlier, even if you remove the constitutional element from it, the spiritual element remains, which is love. And God granted us, you know, that freedom of choice, which is where this all came from. How you would navigate it in a society where these rights are not protected by the government or by the constitution of that country raises another dynamic. And the societal norms and practices would have to determine how you relate to that. The sort of activism that you may be able to do in a society such as ours may not be an option available to you in such a society, since there are some societies which continue to sort of have an intertwine between church and state. So how the issues are navigated in those societies would be a little different. But how I see it is your religious liberty would still exist. It just would not be constitutionally protected, and how it is dealt with would have to be a delicate balance would have to be drawn. Perhaps it would have to be more passive activism rather than being deliberate or bold about it.
I was wondering, thanks for that contribution, meaningful. I was wondering to what extent the and again the attorneys can help me out here if I don't say it right, but the general conventions that we have, the Human Rights Convention and such things, where you may have a communist country, you may have a dictatorship in a particular location, but do we look to human rights conventions, the ILO and those kinds of things, and say, listen, there can be protection under these cases?
I don't know whether we could call it protection, but I know you could get assistance and some lobbying done from those organizations. But sometimes we wonder how much lobbying or assistance or protection we can get from them when we look at what's happening globally. Because in some areas, we would consider it almost inhuman the way people's religious beliefs and the right to practice their religion is treated. So yes, I believe we ought to, I'll say that guardedly, we ought to get some assistance, some lobbying done to assist in that regard when there's not constitutional protection. But the extent to which that is actually present is another story.
I can come in?
Yeah, sure.
Well, the latest case we have at an international level involves the Jehovah's Witness. Now, they wouldn't pray with you. You're aware of that?
Yes.
All right, they just will not pray with you. They will talk with you. They come to the home and they're in charge of the conversation. Actually, I have found the younger Jehovah's Witnesses are a lot more open, and that's the power of youth, to another view. But we have had cases where, in spite of the fact they wouldn't pray with us, they have been outlawed in some countries. And I agree with two attorneys. That's where I was telling somebody recently that when I depart the scene, one of my legacies would be the deep appreciation and bringing in the attorneys into the mainstream of our fight in terms of religious liberty. If you look at our Carla group, we have a number of attorneys there and getting two more in a short order. So that, to my mind, we'll have to have the attorneys and other experts in international law, involved heavily, and perhaps getting close to the political directory. There's a significant case when Saddam Hussein was around in Iraq. That was a similar case because the Christian groups were allowed by Saddam, all right, to worship. So we had a couple thousand members there and we're allowed to worship, but not allowed to evangelize. And there were occasions when some groups attempted to break the law to evangelize, and they would call upon us. And in a very limited way, as much as the law afforded you, and sometimes secretive way, we would meet with them, all right, so their rights could be restored. But I feel what I hear in the panel, and I agree, is that the freedom to worship in whatever context should be guaranteed, okay? Unless that particular organization involves in life-threatening practices, okay, as part of their worship. But I feel that should be guaranteed. And by the way, let me tell you something. We still have a problem, not just with Adventism. A Catholic lady came into my office recently here. She says, Pastor, God, she was one of those, God sent me to you. She said, God sent me to you. And our church in Tonapuna had an interfaith service and God was displeased. I said, what part of it he was displeased with? She says Hindus and Muslims went to the pulpit and they spoke and God was displeased. And God told me, Pastor Dutton will join you in the fight against that. And then I had to tell her quietly that God didn't so reveal to me, so that I feel unless it is very extreme, life-threatening, perhaps they're involved in things like political assassination of people's characters, etc. We should support their right.
Well, it's interesting that you made reference to that, Pastor Dutton. I'm going to come to that in a while, but I remember a few years ago, you may also recall, I'm not sure, I believe it was in Nigeria, where they were burning Christian churches. We know that there is a real struggle in Nigeria between Boko Haram and, part of the country is heavily Muslim, part is heavily Christian, but they were destroying Christian churches. And in a particular location, you know, they were moving from one to another, they were burning them. And when they got to the Seventh Adventist church, the Muslims surrounded the church that night and said, "We are not going to allow you to destroy the Adventist church. They are our good neighbors." And I thought, wow, this is interesting. The Seventh Adventist church is being saved by a Muslim community. And I thought this was a powerful witness. You know, how some of us would react to that. So the question is, does religious liberty require me to simply acknowledge the right to freedom of worship, or does it also require that I protect that right? In other words, if they are, you know, again, I make reference to this experience that I had because just a few years ago, the Muslims were building a mosque here in Antigua, and I got from some religious leaders on the island, non-Seventh Adventist religious leaders, for me to sign a petition with them to stop the Muslims building the mosque. And I had to explain that our denomination believes in religious freedom for all. So if they are Muslims here, they should have the right to build their mosque and to worship as they seem fit. Now, some of the brethren didn't quite agree with me, but that is the concept behind religious liberty. And I'm asking now, if that mosque were to be torn down by quote unquote protesters who call themselves Christians, what should be my perspective, my reaction to that as a Seventh Adventist?
I want to go first before the two attorneys, if you don't mind this time. We have had a situation in Indonesia up to recently that provides an answer to that. Now, how that will be taken and responded to in the Caribbean context may be different. But I would tell you, in Indonesia, we have been involved in rebuilding mosques that have been burnt, because it didn't start with Christianity, it started with the Muslims. They were burning Christian churches, including our church. All right. And then, you know, then we swung around, and then there was some, what could I say, Christian terrorists who were burning, you know, they responded in kind. So then we negotiated, and we were part of the restoration movement. So you had Muslims rebuilding Christian churches and Christian churches rebuilding mosques. So I just thought I should mention that as a kind of, you know, template for going forward if things should reach that way. Because you mentioned about mosque in Antigua. We have a Hindu temple, and Devines had been very, broad in his perception. He was there when they started the first temple in Tobago, recently here, a few months ago. And you have another situation come up in Barbados, because you have a lot of Hindus doing business in Barbados, and they will want a place to worship. So what we're discussing here is very relevant, but I agree with you totally. I was aware of the situation and the role you played. And I agree with you totally, but there are some Adventists who go to their grave not agreeing with you. I want you to know that.
Well, certainly, you know, now in the interest of time, I want to move on, because there are some areas that I want to cover this afternoon. I really want for us to touch the area with our relationship. Now, we have been talking about defending rights, etc., but I want to step that up a little bit in terms of our collaborative approach. So sometimes we challenge when it comes to relating to other Christians and other religious faiths. The Seventh Adventist Church has position statements, you know, as we may know, we do have a website, the Adventist Church, adventist.org, and you can find position statements. There's a statement there on our relationship with Roman Catholics. There's a statement with respect to how we relate to ecumenism. And I particularly want to read a section of that one, the statement on Seventh Adventists and the ecumenical movement. Here's a quote. It says, Seventh Adventists recognize every agency that lifts up Christ before men as a part of the divine plan for the evangelization of the world, and hold in high esteem the Christian men and women in other communions who are engaged in winning souls to Christ. In the church's dealings with other churches, Christian courtesy, friendliness, and fairness are to prevail. So that's quite a statement. What does this say about how we are to view other Christian denominations?
Dr. Greene, if I could jump in here, it
Yes.
goes on the same principle: love, courtesy, respect. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. I could give an example. I remember as a teenager being a part of a trial at my church in my district, and every single year, the Pride Mechanics Lodge would invite us to sing at their anniversary program. And they would treat us so well at that program. I did that for about 13 or 14 years until things went in the church and they didn't have that building anymore to worship in. And you know, today I was surprised that at Pastor Jamal Sanko, that's the executive secretary's crusade in Amelia's ward recently, one of those same persons from the lodge was baptized. And she lived near to Seventh-day Adventists who would invite her to church continually, all the time. They never gave up. They related well with her. And so eventually she came over. So we need to interact. We need to come out. Once it doesn't compromise our religious convictions and our beliefs, we really need to reach out and to see how far we can move the others.
Now, I can almost hear members saying, you let down the church, you know.
Yeah, we had those comments. We had
Of course,
really fire
I
for
can
that
tell you.
every year that we could join the lodge and everything, but we kept doing it. And then I learned recently that 2 others were baptized privately at Bethel Church. They're now members of Bethel. And that's because we kept a relationship with them over the years. We treated them with love, courtesy, and respect, the same way they treated us when we went to their programs.
I mean, I get accused of standing on the same platform with Baptists and Catholics in an independent church service, let alone to what you do. So that is why I'm asking this question. You know, when you look at the statement I just read, the quotation in terms of our relationship with other churches, and it says, if I may just repeat, that we recognize, this part I found to be very interesting, we hold in high esteem the Christian men and women in other communions who are engaged in winning souls to Christ. So we are not therefore to, you know, sometimes I wonder what would happen if all the other Christian churches were to close. You know, we probably have a lot of chaos in society because they do fulfill a meaningful role in curbing violence and in their education work and moral standards, etc. So we ought not to think that because they don't necessarily believe in the Sabbath as we do and as we teach, and we are seeking to reach them with that truth, that we must just turn against them and protest against them. I think this is what the statement is saying here.
Well,
If you would allow me to make one short point too, I was giving another example. I remember for 3 years starting up a Pentecostal choir. They had heard that I'm the choir director for the Seventh-day Adventist Church in Linden, and they didn't have anybody who could teach them parts and so on. And they invited me, and I went. I had to go to the conference to explain why I went and all of that. But I continued training them until there was somebody who could take over and continue, because I found that was a worthwhile activity. It kept the young people from that church together. They weren't getting into criminal activity or anything immoral. And so I helped them for 3 years. And I have found some long-lasting friendships from doing that.
I want to think, Attorney Charles, that when you invite some of those persons to your church, that it's very easy for them to come.
Sure.
Very easy, very easy. Whenever we have anniversary programs or concerts and all of that, they say, give me 12 tickets, give me 14 tickets. I don't have a problem getting through to them because of how I related to them before.
Can I give a sentence before Sister Slack comes on? Can I give you wanted to go ahead, Michelle?
It's okay, I'll defer to you.
Okay. Recently here, we have the ongoing war. I have taken a position where I have, disagreed up to 2 weeks ago with the government and opposition and independent senators for decriminalizing marijuana. And I have found some useful allies in Islam, Hinduism, Pentecostalism, and some other groups. I have had independent senators. Well, they want to keep their job in Trinidad if you vote against the state. The present political culture, you could be moved, and so they sang for their supper. It's not two ways about that. They will tell me privately, I agree with you. Wade Mark, the opposition leader, said all that I said, you know, but it's about votes. All right. They say 1 in 5 in Trinidad smoking marijuana. That's 200,000 plus. You understand? It's about votes. And I have gone, there's a group, call it ecumenical, call it interfaith, but they were formed by Islam, and Islam brought me and a Pentecostal, for starters, to the mosque in Aranguez, which is perhaps the most prominent mosque in the country. And they brought me there. I took off my shoes, you know what I mean? I walked into the mosque. I went into the high office, and one of the key imams, perhaps the #1 imam in Trinidad, sat down there with me, and we hammered out a policy and had it published in all the newspapers. And they paid for the publication. I didn't pay a dime, you understand? And it said what we as a church, they're totally opposed to it. So I feel we lose so much by failing to identify. And by the way, Dr. Carson, I want to say the most radical thing here. I don't believe only Adventists will be saved. And I think that is the problem we have. A lot of Seventh-day Adventists feel, and some pastors feel, only Adventists will be saved. Now, touching sensitive ground there, but I don't believe that. Because I believe God looks at the heart, and God looks at the area of conviction. All right. I believe we're the true church and remnant church, but I don't believe only Adventists will be saved. But I think that is where we go off the radar, you know.
Let me just say one short comment on that, because, you know, one needs to understand the gospel that we preach. We have a responsibility to inform, to educate, to share the good news of salvation and invite people to Jesus. And, you know, we are not just supposed to be preaching to Christians. We are also supposed to be preaching to non-Christians.
Sure.
And that is the greater challenge, because, you know, many of us are accustomed to sharing our faith to fellow Christians. And we just emphasize the whole concept of the Sabbath as one of the apparent differences. But when you meet a Hindu, a Muslim, a Buddhist, sharing Christ with that individual involves so much more. And one needs to understand that God is going to look at the sincerity of the heart. And I think this is what I hear you saying, Pastor Dutton.
Yes, sure.
The sincerity of the heart that matters, and the extent to which an individual is committed to the revelation that they have received. Now, Attorney Slack, I don't know if you were going to come in here with a comment before I go on.
I just wanted to add that sometimes we create unnecessary barriers too readily, and it works to our advantage. And what we should do instead is to capitalize on the similarities and use that as the launching pad to carry out our mission.
Very well. Now, so
that's one little point, if you don't mind.
Go ahead.
You might have heard that the Catholics brought Alveda King, the granddaughter of Martin Luther King, to Trinidad on the fight against abortion. And I grabbed that hook, line, and sinker. They had a march, they had a big program that was carried all over the media, nationally and internationally, the fight against abortion. And where some members lost it is that Alveda King is not a Catholic. I believe she's American Fundamental Baptist, okay? She's not a Catholic. So sometimes I believe, you know, Pope Benedict had made a statement once. He said there's a time for dialogue and there's a time for witness. And that has stayed with me. You know, there are times we just have to build relations with the people and not try at that point to evangelize them. But some people always have to evangelize, you know what I mean? I think that's a challenge we have.
Very well. Now let me move on. We have like 10 minutes, so we have to really rush here. I mean, we can go on for the whole afternoon, but you know, time would not allow us. So I received an invitation to preach in another Christian denomination. My local congregation believes that it is a denial of the faith to accept it. What should I do as a Seventh Adventist? We're talking about building bridges. We're talking about relationships and associations. And by the way, I have received a lot of invitations to do seminars, family life seminars, etc., in other denominations. And of course, I go and I do them. But then there are those who believe you have no right going to do that. You have no right, preaching from their pulpit etc. What do I say in a situation like this to a Seventh Adventist who really believes that, hey, the conference president is going too far, is going overboard?
I would probably ask them the question, what would Jesus do? And I will give an example here. Recently, President Irfan Ali called this whole countrywide prayer session with all the religious people and so on. And guess who they chose? Who they chose? Pastor Exton Clark, the president of the Ghana conference. And up to this day, people are still talking about the message that he presented when all those different denominations were present. He wasn't invited into church, but he was certainly invited to an event, a public event that had great social media and other coverage to present God's word. And he did so with power and conviction, and he left an indelible mark and an example of Seventh-day Adventism after doing that. So let's go back to what Attorney Slack says. We have to love and respect. What would Jesus have done? He interacted with all kinds of people when he walked this earth. So we should go and let them understand.
I think the bottom line is a lot of people struggle with this question, and I'm going to put it out there now. Can we, as Seventh-day Adventists, can we be prophetically faithful to our belief and still reach out in brotherly love to other denominations? And this is what people struggle with. So let's respond to this.
Yes, I mean, if Michelle doesn't want to come in now, but I say yes, I say 1,000 times yes. Now I should tell you, some people see me as a lost cause. They will die saying I'm a Jesuit priest and I've sold out to the Catholics. And you know where that started? When we had a program in Stanmore, an interfaith program, and they lit candles in memory of, it had nothing to do with State of the Dead, of those who died from AIDS. And there's an offshoot group who pummeled me, they hounded me. Some even felt that, it should stop, get rid of Dottin one time. He's obviously, take the credentials. He's selling out the church. And I was just being Christian. And I was telling somebody, if even in the back of their minds, they wanted to lie, look, Harvey was perhaps one of the most prominent Catholic priests in the region, all right, if not in Latin America. He came to me after and said, Pastor, I'm sorry what I put you through. We should never have had any candles in the church. Look at what they're doing to your own, doing to you. And I felt badly for them, because imagine the Catholic priest telling me, look at what they're doing to you. So that I think we are vicious at times when it comes to this issue. Elder, you are touching a raw nerve. We are vicious at times with how we treat even with our own. Far more how we treat with Muslims and Hindus. I see a post, Sister Leslie, and I'm sure you have seen it. We have an Adventist group who has a post in Guyana. And I am saying, if you have to criticize the government, criticize the government. But I mean, every post and everything, even internationally, they're boasting how they block one of the officials in a church in New York from speaking there. They're boasting about that. But every single post is negative. And I'm saying, I'm sure the government must be doing something positive, And by the way, Dr. Carson, in some of our countries like Trinidad, Tobago, Guyana, and Suriname, where race, religion, and class and politics so intertwined, we lose it with some of our, especially our non-Christian brethren. We destroy our evangelistic potential or quotient, whatever you call it. And I think we have to be so careful.
Very well. Sister Michelle?
Yes, I agree 100% with what was said, definitely. And I believe we actually have a duty to reach out to our brothers and sisters of other denominations. After all, the Gospel Commission instructs us to do that. It's not just limited to us.
Now, we have time for one final question, and I have to get this in because we have spoken a lot about how we relate to Baptists and Pentecostals and so on. But when it comes to other religions, the Hindus, the Muslims, I remember one individual calling me one day and said it was after 9/11, and the American government had called for National Day of Prayer. I believe Barry Black was the preacher on that occasion. but there were prayers by the imam, there were prayers by the Hindus and so on. And the individual that called me was concerned. How in the world could we be praying on the same platform with Muslims and Hindus, and who are they praying to, and how does that prayer become kosher, so to speak? So this question, the relationship with other religions, is it appropriate for me to visit a Hindu mass? By the way, I was in Jamaica recently, and well, when I say recently, just before COVID, I think it was 2018, and I got to talking to Iman. I think he was from Trinidad, Pastor Dutton, and he and I struck up a nice conversation. And the gentleman told me, he said, "Listen, I look forward every year to going to Christmas dinner with my Adventist neighbors."
Of course.
And he shared how he enjoys it, etc. I was amazed at how open he was, at how friendly he was, And he said, "Next time you visit my country, come to my mosque." Now, the question is, how do I relate to an invitation to go to a Hindu service? They are not worshiping Jesus Christ. How do I relate to that?
I do it all the time, and it should be done, and you have a chance to witness to them. I was in a Hindu program this year, all right? Was it this year? No, last year. And an issue of the Sabbath came up, and here the issue. So listen, Elder, you are going to have build a bridge you can't build otherwise. Because I think we only want to preach to people. We don't want to relate to people. We have a service now. We're going to baptize about 100 in Central Trinidad with Vinton Charles from St. Lucia. All right. He's now settled in Trinidad with his family. And I will tell you straight. I mean, I am concerned about how those people are going to be conserved. Already there are elements of a little racism playing off. So I am saying educate, educate, educate. And we have to admit we are far from where Christ wants us to be. Christ wants us to love the Hindu man and the Muslim man and even worship with him. I mean, we know the God we are praying to. All right. I wouldn't take the candle and pull it around the murti. I wouldn't do that. But to say attend the service and relate, yes, I would. I wouldn't take the candle, the practice to do with the deer and move it around. I wouldn't have nothing to do with that. I will stay in my seat. But in terms of relating, yes. And going to the service, yes.
Now, our time is just about up, but I'll allow you two attorneys to comment briefly. Attorney Charles? Okay, go ahead.
I just wanted to add the caveat that for me, it depends on who I'm advising in a situation such as that. Someone who is sure of what he believes in, I believe I would more readily encourage them. You've received an invitation, go ahead. Somebody who is new to the faith, or somebody who is still struggling with certain beliefs that we hold as Adventist Christians, I would advise to be cautious. Satisfy yourself of what you believe in first. Have a knowledge of what perhaps the Muslims believe in, because there are many similarities and you don't want to confuse yourself. And if you have a mission, focus, or purpose in mind, then fine, I see no issue with it.
Attorney Charles?
Yes, for new believers, you can't just let them go out there not fully grounded. But for those of us who know what in whom we believe and what we believe, by all means, I would go. I've had several invitations to speak to women at different churches, and I honor all of them because it's a way of building a bridge that never come apart, and building relationships is so important. And I believe we should always do that, because if we are to fulfill the Gospel Commission, then we have to really go into all the world, literally all the world, in terms of meeting people.
Thank you so much. What I hear you both saying is that you don't take a kindergartner and put him in Form 5 to mingle and discuss with them, because obviously that would be very confusing for him. So one ought to be able to, Apostle Paul talks about milk and then solid food, and so Christian maturity plays a part there, of course, most definitely. It was an interesting discussion, and I'm very grateful for the contribution that you all have made. It's a discussion that we need to continue sometime in the future, because we kind of did rush. We only have 1 hour, and I would really want to go into some more details, but such is the nature of things.
Dr. Greene, just one little word.
Yes.
I keep saying educate, educate. We have to do a lot better with our churches.
I think that is very important, Pastor Dutton. You know, the idea of, and there's so many areas that we need to educate people in. We have a mission to fulfill, and it is a mission not just to fellow Christians. It is a mission to the world. And like I said earlier, you know, it's easy to say to a Pentecostal, accept the Sabbath. But when you meet a Muslim or Hindu or Baha'i or Zoroastrian, you know, what do you talk to them about? So we have to understand that there are different levels of, you know, and know people. And the matter that Attorney Slack stressed so much this afternoon, the matter of building solid relationships, because when my neighbor and I are really connecting on an individual level, when she sees me or he sees me as a kind, caring, compassionate individual, then it is easy for me to relate to that individual, to invite them to come to church with me. But it is so much more difficult when they are total strangers. In fact, if I'm having an evangelistic campaign and I go across the fence to hand them an invitation when I never said good morning to them or good afternoon or how do you do, then they definitely don't want to see me. So relationship is very important. Well, friends, that's all the time we have for today. Next week, we are going to be, we have spent 4 weeks on religious liberty, so we're going to move on and talk about other things. But next week, we have a very interesting discussion. We are coming out of the COVID pandemic era, and so many persons are indicating that their congregation is not what it used to be before COVID, because so many persons are staying home and watching church online. So next week we want to address the issue of, does online church encourage irreverence? Can I really, we're going to discuss that next week. I don't want to go into it now, but we're going to talk about worshiping online versus worshiping in person and the implications to that. That's a very interesting discussion for next week on Let's Talk. May God bless you and see you then.